Nobody prepares you for the moment when the most powerful person in the world locks eyes with you across a crowded room. Especially when you're holding a camera you barely know how to use, wearing a borrowed suit that's 2 sizes too big, and trying to blend into the background at your sister's wedding. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story, this absolutely insane, life-changing story, it all started with a desperate phone call and my complete inability to say no to my family. 3 weeks before my sister Jessica's wedding, I was living my perfectly ordinary life in Portland, Oregon. I worked as a junior accountant at Henderson & Associates, spent my weekends playing video games, and my biggest photography experience was taking blurry pictures of my food for Instagram. Not exactly the resume of someone you'd trust with capturing the most important day of someone's life. That's when Jessica called me, sobbing. "Marcus, I don't know what to do. David just called. He's been in a car accident. Nothing serious, thank God, but his right arm is in a cast and he can't hold a camera. The wedding is in 3 weeks and every decent photographer in Seattle is already booked." David Chen was supposed to be their wedding photographer. I'd met him once at their engagement party. This incredibly talented guy with expensive equipment and a portfolio that looked like it belonged in magazines. The complete opposite of me and my cracked iPhone camera. "What about postponing?" I suggested, knowing even as I said it that it wasn't realistic. They'd been planning this wedding for 2 years. The venue was booked, guests had already bought plane tickets, and Jessica's dress had been altered 3 times to perfection. "We can't, Marcus. Mom's flying in from Florida, Uncle Robert is coming from Denver, and you know how hard it was to get everyone's schedules to align. Plus, the venue deposit alone was $15,000. I could hear the panic in her voice, that same tone she'd used when we were kids, and she'd broken Mom's favorite vase. Jessica had always been the responsible one, the planner, the sister who had her entire life mapped out in color-coded calendars. This kind of last-minute disaster was her worst nightmare. What about hiring someone else, maybe someone newer who might have availability? "I've called everyone, Marcus. Everyone good is booked, and the ones who aren't, let's just say their portfolios looked like they learned photography from a cereal box. I'm running out of options here." There was a long pause, and I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. I should have seen it coming, but I was too focused on trying to solve her problem to realize I was about to become the solution. "You know," she said slowly, "you've always been good with that camera of yours." "Jess, I take pictures of coffee cups and sunsets. This is completely different." "But you have an eye for it. Remember that photo you took of Mom and Dad at Christmas? Everyone said it was beautiful." She was referring to a lucky shot I'd captured of our parents laughing by the fireplace. It was nice, sure, but it was also a pure accident. The lighting happened to be perfect, and I'd hit the shutter button at exactly the right moment. "That was one photo, Jessica. A wedding has hundreds of moments, important moments, moments you can't recreate if I mess them up." I know it's a lot to ask, but Marcus, you're my brother. You know what matters to me, you know the family, you'd capture the real moments, not just the pose stuff. And honestly, at this point, you're my only option. The desperation in her voice got to me. Jessica had always been there for me. When I'd struggled through college, when I'd gotten laid off from my first job, when I'd gone through that terrible breakup with Sarah 2 years ago. She'd never asked me for anything major in return. "I don't even have the right equipment," I said weakly. "David said he'd lend us his backup camera and some basic lenses. Nothing too complicated. And his assistant, Monica, she's still available to help with the technical stuff. You wouldn't be doing it alone." I found myself wavering. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was a terrible idea. Wedding photography was a specialized skill that took years to develop. One person's amateur hobby couldn't just substitute for professional expertise, especially not for something this important. But then, Jessica played her trump card. "Marcus, I trust you more than any stranger I could hire off the internet. This isn't just about getting pictures. It's about having someone there who cares about capturing the real story of our day. Someone who knows that the important moments might not be the obvious ones." When she put it like that, how could I say no? 2 days later, I was driving up to Seattle with David's camera equipment carefully arranged in my back seat like precious cargo. He'd given me a crash course in the basics: aperture, shutter speed, ISO settings, and while my head was spinning with technical information, I was determined not to let Jessica down. The wedding was being held at Thornwood Castle, this stunning historic venue on American Lake. When I arrived for the rehearsal, I was immediately intimidated. This wasn't some simple backyard ceremony. This was an elegant affair with a guest list that included Jessica's new in-laws, who apparently had some serious connections in politics and business. That's when I first heard about the backup photographer situation. "Oh, you must be Marcus," said Patricia Whitmore, the wedding planner, in a tone that suggested she'd already written me off. "Jessica mentioned you'd be helping out with photography. Don't worry about getting in anyone's way. We have Monica handling the main shots, and you can just catch whatever she misses." Monica Chen, David's assistant, was professional but clearly stressed about having to work with an amateur. She showed me the shot list: formal family portraits, ceremony highlights, reception candids, and assigned me to what she called backup duty. "Just stay in the background," she instructed. "Get some candid shots of guests, maybe some detailed photos of the flowers and decorations. Nothing too important. I'll handle all the crucial moments." It stung a little, being relegated to the sidelines at my own sister's wedding, but I understood. Monica was the professional. I was just the emergency fill-in. My job was to stay out of the way and maybe capture a few nice supplementary shots. The morning of the wedding, I arrived early to help with setup. The venue was transformed: elegant white and gold decorations, hundreds of white roses, and round tables arranged perfectly around a dance floor that gleamed under crystal chandeliers. It was the kind of setting that belonged in fairy tales, exactly what Jessica had always dreamed of. As guests began arriving, I noticed the caliber of people walking through the doors. These weren't just family and friends. There were people in expensive suits talking quietly in corners, men with earpieces standing near the entrances, and a general air of importance that made me nervous about messing up even my small role. Quite a guest list. I mentioned to Monica as we checked our equipment one final time. "Jessica's fiancé has some connected family," she replied cryptically. "Just stick to the plan, stay in the background, and we'll be fine." The ceremony began at 4 o'clock, and it was beautiful. Jessica looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, and when she walked down the aisle with our father, I actually forgot about the camera for a moment and just watched my little sister become a bride. I dutifully took my background shots, guests wiping away tears, the flower girl playing with her basket, candid moments of joy and celebration. Monica was handling all the main action, positioning herself perfectly to capture Jessica and Michael's vows, the ring exchange, and that magical first kiss as husband and wife. Everything was going according to plan. I was doing my job, staying out of the way, getting some decent supplementary shots that wouldn't make or break anyone's wedding album. Then, during the cocktail hour, everything changed. I was crouched behind a pillar, trying to get an artistic shot of the late afternoon light streaming through the castle windows, when I heard a commotion near the main entrance. Several men in dark suits had suddenly appeared, speaking rapidly into their sleeves and scanning the crowd with professional intensity. Monica grabbed my arm. "Something's happening," she whispered urgently. "Look at the security detail that just walked in." That's when I saw him walking through the main doors of Thornwood Castle like he owned the place, surrounded by what was clearly a Secret Service detail. I recognized him immediately from countless news broadcasts and magazine covers. The President of the United States had just walked into my sister's wedding reception, and he was looking directly at me. My first instinct was to look behind me, thinking the president must be acknowledging someone important standing nearby. But there was nobody there except me, crouched awkwardly behind a marble pillar with David's camera hanging around my neck like some kind of amateur spy. The president, and I still couldn't believe I was thinking those words, continued walking in my direction. His security detail flanked him on both sides, their eyes constantly scanning the crowd, but his focus seemed entirely on me. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice was exactly like it sounded on television but somehow more personal, more real. "Are you the photographer?" I stood up so quickly that I nearly knocked over a nearby arrangement of white orchids. Yes, sir. Well, sort of. I'm the backup photographer. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. He smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed his face from the serious political figure I'd seen in news conferences to someone who seemed almost approachable. Marcus Thompson, right? The fact that he knew my name sent a jolt of confusion through my system. How could the President of the United States possibly know who I was? I was a junior accountant from Portland who'd been thrust into wedding photography duty 3 weeks ago. Yes, sir, how did you… Your sister Jessica mentioned you in her letter, he said, as if that explained everything, which it didn't, at all. Letter? The invitation letter she sent to the White House. She wrote about how her brother had stepped up to save her wedding when her original photographer was injured. She mentioned you were nervous about taking on such an important responsibility, but that she trusted you completely because you see things differently than other people. My mind was reeling. Jessica had invited the president to her wedding, and he had actually come? This was information that definitely should have been shared with the backup photographer, who was currently having what felt like a mild heart attack. Sir, I have to ask, why are you here? I mean, not to be rude, but Jessica didn't mention that you'd be attending. The president glanced around the reception, taking in the elegant decorations and the clusters of guests who were all very carefully pretending not to stare at him while obviously staring at him. Michael's grandfather, General Robert Whitmore, served as my military advisor during my first campaign. He's been a mentor and friend for over a decade. When his grandson was getting married, well, it seemed like the right thing to do to show up and congratulate the family. General Whitmore. That explained the security detail I'd noticed among the wedding guests, and probably why Monica had been so cagey about the connected family comment. The thing is, Marcus, the president continued, my official photographer had to stay back in Washington due to a security briefing that ran long. And my personal detail photographer is currently dealing with a family emergency, so I find myself in a position where I need someone to document this visit. I felt the blood drain from my face. Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm really just the backup photographer. Monica Chen is handling all the important shots, and she's the professional here. I'm just taking some background candidates. Actually, he said, I specifically requested you. I'm sorry, what? I read what your sister wrote about you in her letter. She said you have this ability to capture moments that other people miss, that you see the story behind the posed pictures. That's exactly what I need right now. This had to be some kind of surreal dream. Maybe I'd fallen asleep during this ceremony and was having an anxiety-induced nightmare about being given impossible responsibilities. Sir, with all due respect, I've been taking pictures for about 4 hours total, and most of them are probably blurry. You need someone with experience, someone who knows what they're doing. Marcus, can I tell you something? The president's voice took on a more serious tone, and his security detail adjusted their positions slightly to give us more privacy. I've been photographed by professionals my entire political career. They're technically perfect. They know all the right angles, they capture exactly what they're supposed to capture. He paused, looking out at the reception where Jessica and Michael were making their rounds, greeting guests with radiant smiles. But sometimes, the most important moments aren't the ones we plan for. Sometimes they happen in between the official shots, in the spaces where people forget they're being watched. Your sister seems to think you're good at finding those moments. I looked down at the camera in my hands, this piece of equipment that had felt foreign and intimidating just hours ago. What exactly would you need me to do? Nothing complicated, just document this visit naturally. A few shots of me congratulating the happy couple, maybe some candids with General Whitmore, perhaps a group photo with the family. But I want it to feel real, not staged. Can you do that? The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was way beyond my capabilities. But there was something in the president's manner, something genuine and trusting, that made me want to try. I can try, I said, but I should warn you, I might mess this up completely. You know what, Marcus? I have a feeling you're going to do just fine. What happened next was probably the most surreal hour of my life. The president rejoined the reception, and I found myself in the bizarre position of being his unofficial documentarian. But instead of the stiff, formal photo session I'd expected, it turned out to be surprisingly natural. I watched through my viewfinder as he approached Jessica and Michael, saw the genuine surprise and delight on their faces when they realized who was congratulating them. Instead of posed handshakes, I captured the moment when Jessica actually hugged the president, her wedding dress trailing behind her as she laughed with pure joy. When he sat down with General Whitmore, instead of asking them to look at the camera, I hung back and photographed their conversation, two old friends sharing stories and memories, completely at ease with each other despite the formal setting. The president was right about something else too. The more I watched through the camera lens, the more I started to see moments that might have been missed otherwise. The way his eyes lit up when one of the flower girls shyly asked for his autograph. The gentle way he helped Jessica's elderly grandmother to her feet when she insisted on being introduced. The moment when he and Michael's father started laughing about something completely unrelated to politics or weddings. But it was during the reception dinner that things took another unexpected turn. I was taking some candid shots of the head table when I noticed a commotion near the kitchen entrance. Several members of the Secret Service were speaking urgently into their communication devices, and there was a sudden tension in the air that hadn't been there before. The president, mid-conversation with the bride and groom, noticed it too. One of his agents approached the table and whispered something in his ear. I saw his expression change, becoming more serious and focused. He stood up from the table, and the entire reception seemed to pause, sensing that something significant was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "I'm afraid I need to step away for a few minutes to handle an urgent matter. Please, continue celebrating this beautiful occasion. I'll be back shortly." As he moved toward a private area of the venue with his security team, he caught my eye and gestured for me to follow. "Sir?" I asked, confused about why the backup photographer would be needed for what was clearly official business. "Bring the camera," he said quietly. "There's something you need to document." The president led me through a side corridor of Thornwood Castle, past oil paintings of long-dead aristocrats, and into what appeared to be a private study. His security detail had already swept the room and positioned themselves at strategic points. Their professional alertness, a stark contrast to the wedding celebration continuing in the main hall. "Sir, I'm not sure I should be here," I said, suddenly very aware that I was about to witness something that was probably way above my security clearance, which was exactly 0. "Actually, Marcus, you're exactly where you need to be." He moved to a secure phone that had been set up on an antique mahogany desk. "What I'm about to handle, it's going to be historic, and sometimes history needs witnesses." Before I could ask what he meant, the phone rang. He answered on the first ring, his voice immediately shifting into the authoritative tone I recognized from press conferences. "This is President Harrison. Give me the situation." I stood frozen in the corner, camera hanging around my neck, wondering if I should leave or stay or maybe just disappear into the elaborate wallpaper. Through the phone speaker, I could hear fragments of what sounded like a crisis briefing, words like satellite imagery, diplomatic breakthrough, and narrow window of opportunity. The president listened intently, occasionally asking sharp questions that demonstrated he was processing complex information at lightning speed. After about 10 minutes, he hung up and turned to me with an expression that was part exhaustion, part determination. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. What's about to happen? It can't be documented by official White House photographers. It needs to be captured by someone who isn't part of the political machine, someone who can show the human side of what we're dealing with. I don't understand. What's happening?" He walked to the window, looking out at American Lake where the sun was beginning to set behind the trees. "We've been in secret negotiations for months about a hostage situation overseas. 12 American citizens, including a family with 2 young children, have been held by a hostile group in Eastern Europe. Tonight, we finally have a chance to bring them home." The weight of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about wedding photos anymore. This was about people's lives, about families being reunited, about decisions that would affect real human beings in the most profound way possible. "The operation is happening right now as we speak," he continued. "In about 20 minutes I'll receive confirmation whether our people are safe. And I want that moment documented, not for political purposes, not for campaign materials, but for history. For the families who deserve to know that their government never stopped fighting to bring their loved ones home." Sir, this is way beyond anything I'm qualified to handle. This is the kind of moment that should be captured by professionals, by people who understand the gravity of what they're documenting. He turned back to face me, and I saw something in his expression that I hadn't expected: vulnerability. "Marcus, do you know why I really requested you specifically? It wasn't just because of what your sister wrote in her letter, though that was part of it." He sat down heavily in one of the study's leather chairs. "It's because you're not part of this world. You don't have any agenda, you're not thinking about how these photos might be used politically. You're just a guy who stepped up to help his sister, and who sees things as they really are." The phone rang again, cutting through the tension. This time, the conversation was shorter, but more intense. I caught fragments about extraction successful and all personnel accounted for, and I watched as the president's entire demeanor shifted from tense anticipation to profound relief. When he hung up, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "They're safe, all 12 of them. They're coming home." That's when I understood what he meant about documenting history. This wasn't about politics or public relations. This was about a human being, who happened to be the most powerful person in the world, receiving news that 12 families would be reunited because of decisions he'd made and risks he'd taken. Without really thinking about it, I raised the camera and took the shot. It wasn't a technically perfect photograph. The lighting was dim, the composition was spontaneous, and I probably got the settings wrong. But it captured something real, the moment when relief and gratitude and the weight of responsibility all converged on one person's face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That's exactly what this moment deserved." But the evening wasn't over. As we prepared to return to the wedding reception, the president received yet another call. This one was different. His chief of staff was calling to inform him that news of the successful rescue operation had leaked to the media, and press outlets were already trying to track down his location. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Maybe 30 minutes before the first news vans arrive at the venue," came the reply through the speaker. "We should consider immediate departure." I watched the president's face as he processed this information. He looked toward the main hall where Jessica's wedding reception was still in full swing, where guests were dancing and laughing and celebrating one of the happiest days of my sister's life. "No," he said firmly, "we're not cutting this short. General Whitmore's grandson is getting married, and we're going to see this celebration through properly." "Sir, the security implications." "I understand the implications, but sometimes doing the right thing means accepting a little risk. We'll handle the media when they arrive, but right now, we have a wedding to finish." He turned to me with a slight smile. "Besides, I promised Marcus here that we'd get some good shots of the cake cutting, and I always keep my promises." When we returned to the reception, the atmosphere had shifted slightly. Word had somehow spread among the guests that something significant had happened, and there was an undercurrent of excitement and curiosity mixing with the wedding celebration. Jessica immediately approached us, her face showing the concern of someone who knew her special day had become something much bigger than she'd planned. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Some of the guests are saying there are news trucks setting up outside." The president put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Everything is perfectly fine, Jessica. Better than fine, actually. 12 American families are going to be reunited with their loved ones tonight, and I can't think of a more appropriate place to receive that news than at a celebration of love and commitment." The way he said it, with such genuine warmth and sincerity, reminded me why he'd been elected in the first place. This wasn't just political rhetoric. This was a leader who understood that the big moments and small moments of life were all connected. "Now," he continued, "I believe there's supposed to be cake cutting happening soon, and I've been looking forward to seeing whether the groom follows through on his threat to smash cake in the bride's face." Jessica laughed, and just like that, the tension dissolved. The reception continued, but now it had an extra layer of significance. We weren't just celebrating Jessica and Michael's marriage. We were celebrating the fact that other families would soon be celebrating reunions of their own. As the evening progressed, I found myself documenting not just the wedding but this unique intersection of personal celebration and historic moment. The photos I took that night would never be published, would never be seen by anyone outside the families involved, but they captured something unprecedented. And then, just as the president had predicted, the media arrived. The first news van pulled up just as Jessica and Michael were about to cut their 4-tier vanilla cake with raspberry filling. Through the castle's tall windows, I could see the bright lights of camera crews setting up equipment, their telephoto lenses aimed at the reception hall like artillery pieces. Within minutes, what had been a private family celebration transformed into something resembling a media siege. The Secret Service immediately shifted into high alert mode, with agents taking positions at every window and entrance. The wedding guests, most of whom had no idea what was happening, found themselves caught in the middle of a breaking news story. Ladies and gentlemen, Patricia Whitmore, the wedding planner, announced with impressive composure, "We're going to continue with our planned festivities. Please remain calm and enjoy yourselves." But it was impossible to ignore the chaos building outside. More news vans arrived every few minutes, followed by satellite trucks and what looked like half the Seattle press corps. The peaceful lakeside venue had become the epicenter of a media frenzy. The president, meanwhile, seemed remarkably unfazed by the commotion. He was deep in conversation with General Whitmore, both men occasionally glancing toward the windows where camera flashes were going off like lightning strikes. "This is unbelievable," Monica whispered to me as we watched another crew set up outside. "I've photographed celebrity weddings, political events, even some royal functions, but I've never seen anything like this." She was right. This was beyond surreal. 3 hours ago, I'd been worried about taking decent pictures of my sister's bouquet toss. Now I was in the middle of what would undoubtedly be front-page news across the country. That's when the president's chief of staff approached me directly. Marcus Thompson? He was a serious-looking man in his 50s, with the kind of intense focus that suggested he hadn't slept properly in months. "I'm William Crawford, White House Chief of Staff. I need to speak with you privately." We stepped into a quieter corner of the reception hall, away from the increasingly anxious wedding guests. "The president has informed me that you've been documenting this evening's events," Crawford said. "I need you to understand the sensitivity of what you've witnessed and photographed." My stomach dropped. Was I in trouble? Had I somehow violated federal laws by taking pictures during that phone call? "Those photographs you took during the hostage rescue confirmation, they're potentially classified material. We need to discuss how they'll be handled." "Sir, I can delete them right now if that's what you need," I said quickly. I never intended to photograph anything sensitive. I was just following the president's instructions. Crawford studied me for a moment, then glanced back toward the president, who was now helping Jessica's elderly aunt navigate around the media chaos brewing outside. "Actually, that's not what we want. The president specifically requested that those photos be preserved, but handled through proper channels. What I need from you is your agreement to submit the images for official review, after which they'll likely be archived as historical documents." Historical documents. My blurry, amateur photographs were potentially going to end up in presidential archives. "However," Crawford continued, "there's a more immediate issue. The media outside knows something significant happened here tonight, but they don't know what. They're going to be looking for anyone who might have information or photographs. You need to be prepared for that attention." Before I could respond, Jessica appeared at my elbow, looking frazzled but determined. "Marcus, what's going on?" "Half my wedding guests are asking if they should leave, the other half are trying to get closer to the windows to see what's happening, and Aunt Margaret just asked me if we're all going to be on the evening news." The weight of the situation hit me then. This wasn't just about me anymore. My sister's perfect wedding day was being overshadowed by events completely beyond her control, and somehow I was at the center of it all. "Jess, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen to your wedding." "Are you kidding me?" she said, but her expression wasn't angry. It was excited. "Marcus, my little brother just helped document one of the most important moments of this presidency. At my wedding. This is like something out of a movie." That's when the president rejoined our conversation, his security detail flanking him, as they navigated through the increasingly chaotic reception. "Jessica, I owe you an enormous apology," he said. "Your beautiful wedding has turned into a media circus, and that's entirely my fault." "Mr. President, with all due respect, if you think I'm upset about having the most memorable wedding in family history, you're completely wrong," Jessica replied with the same confidence she'd shown when she was 8 years old and convinced our parents to let her adopt 3 stray cats. "But I am concerned about my guests and my brother." The president looked at me thoughtfully. "Marcus, I have a proposition for you. The media outside is going to want answers about what happened here tonight. We can try to sneak you out the back way, hope they don't identify you, and let you return to your normal life in Portland. Or what? Or you can help me tell this story the right way. Tomorrow morning I'm holding a press conference about the successful rescue operation. I'd like you to be there, not as a witness but as someone who documented a historic moment. Your photographs, with proper review and approval, could help show the American people the human side of the decisions we make in the Oval Office." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. 3 hours ago I'd been a backup photographer worried about disappointing my sister. Now the President of the United States was asking me to help tell a story that would reach millions of people. "I don't know anything about press conferences or dealing with media attention," I said honestly. "Neither did I before I ran for office," he replied with a slight smile. "But sometimes the most authentic voices come from people who aren't trained to speak to cameras. Sometimes they come from accountants who pick up cameras to help their sisters." Outside, the media presence had grown even larger. I could see news anchors setting up for live broadcasts, their faces illuminated by camera lights, as they reported on breaking developments. The story was already moving beyond our control. "What about the wedding?" I asked, looking around at the reception that had become something entirely different than what Jessica had planned. "Actually," said Michael, Jessica's new husband, joining the conversation for the first time, "I have an idea about that." Michael had been surprisingly calm throughout the entire evening, adapting to each new development with the kind of steady composure that probably made him good at his job as an emergency room physician. "What if we lean into this instead of fighting it?" he suggested. "This reception is already going to be remembered forever. What if we make it something special for everyone here, instead of letting it be derailed by the chaos outside?" "What do you mean?" Jessica asked. "I mean, we have the President of the United States at our wedding reception. We have a room full of family and friends who will never experience anything like this again. And we have my new brother-in-law, who just witnessed and documented a moment that's going to be in history books." Michael looked around the room, then back at the president. "Sir, would you be willing to give a toast? Not for the cameras outside, but for the people in this room? Help us turn this into the celebration it was meant to be, instead of letting it become just another news story." The president considered this for a moment, then broke into the widest smile I'd seen from him all evening. "Michael, I think that's the best idea anyone has had all night." And that's when this already impossible evening took one final, unexpected turn. What happened next was something that no amount of wedding planning could have prepared us for. The president walked to the center of the reception hall, and without any fanfare or official announcement, he simply tapped his champagne glass with a dinner knife. The room fell silent immediately. Even the Secret Service agents seemed to relax slightly, understanding that this moment was about to become something special rather than something they needed to manage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the president began, his voice carrying easily across the room, "I know this evening has taken some unexpected turns. When I arrived here tonight to celebrate Jessica and Michael's wedding, I had no idea that we would also be celebrating something else entirely, the safe return of 12 American citizens who will soon be reunited with their families." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Many of the guests were hearing about the rescue operation for the first time. But standing here now, surrounded by all of you, I realize that both celebrations are really about the same thing: love, commitment, and the lengths we go to for the people who matter most to us. I found myself automatically raising the camera, capturing not just the president's speech but the faces of the guests as they absorbed the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Jessica's grandmother was dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief. Michael's father had his arm around his wife's shoulders. Even the wedding planner, Patricia, was watching with rapt attention. Jessica and Michael, the president continued, turning toward the bride and groom, your love story is just beginning, but it's already taught me something important. When Jessica's original photographer was injured, she didn't panic or postpone or settle for second best. She called her brother Marcus, someone she trusted completely, someone she knew would capture not just the posed moments, but the real story of your day. Every eye in the room turned toward me, and I felt my face burning with embarrassment and pride in equal measure. That decision, to trust family, to believe that sometimes the best choice isn't the most obvious one, that's the kind of thinking that changes the world. It's the kind of thinking that brought 12 Americans home tonight. The president raised his champagne glass, and everyone in the room followed suit. So let's toast not just to Jessica and Michael's future together, but to the power of believing in each other, to taking risks on the people we love, and to the extraordinary things that happen when ordinary people step up to meet extraordinary moments. The room erupted in applause, and I caught myself wiping away tears as I continued photographing. This wasn't just a wedding toast. This was a moment that connected a small family celebration to something much larger and more meaningful. But the president wasn't finished. Now I understand there's quite a bit of media attention outside, and I know that can feel overwhelming, but I want everyone in this room to understand something. You're not just witnesses to tonight's events. You're part of the story. The families of those rescued Americans, when they learn about where and how we celebrated their loved ones' freedom, they're going to want to know about all of you. He looked around the room, making eye contact with different guests as he spoke. They're going to want to know about the bride who shared her special day with strangers she'll never meet. They're going to want to know about the groom who suggested we celebrate together instead of letting fear divide us. They're going to want to know about the brother who stepped up when he was needed and captured moments that will help tell this story for generations. The weight of his words settled over the room like a blanket. We weren't just wedding guests anymore. We were part of something historic. So when you leave here tonight, when people ask you what it was like to be here, I hope you'll tell them it was exactly what America should be. Families supporting each other, strangers becoming friends, and people choosing hope over fear, even when the stakes couldn't be higher. As the applause died down, something remarkable happened. Instead of the reception winding down, or people becoming anxious about the media circus outside, the celebration intensified. Guests who had been strangers an hour ago were now talking animatedly about the historic evening they'd shared. The dance floor filled up again, with couples dancing to songs that would forever remind them of this impossible night. I continued photographing, but now with a completely different understanding of what I was documenting. These weren't just wedding photos. They were historical records of how ordinary people responded to extraordinary circumstances. Around midnight, as the reception began to naturally wind down, the president pulled me aside one final time. Marcus, I want you to know that what you've done tonight, stepping up for your sister, documenting these moments, helping us remember the human side of history, it matters more than you realize. Sir, I just took some pictures. I'm not even sure they're any good. The technical quality isn't what makes a photograph important, he said. What makes it important is whether it tells a true story about a moment that mattered. And tonight, you told several true stories. He handed me a business card with an official White House seal. That's the direct line to my personal photographer's office. In about a week, when the immediate media attention dies down, I'd like you to consider coming to Washington. Not permanently, not as a career change, but as a consultant on a special project we're developing. What kind of project? We're creating an initiative to document American stories that don't usually make the news. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things, families supporting each other through difficult times, communities coming together in ways that remind us what this country is really about. He smiled at my obvious confusion. Marcus, you have something that can't be taught in photography school. You see people as they really are, not as they think they should appear. That's exactly what we need. As the evening finally came to an end, I found myself standing outside Thornwood Castle with Jessica and Michael, watching the last of the news vans pack up their equipment. The media had gotten their story, the successful rescue operation, the president's unexpected appearance at a private wedding. the human interest angle of the backup photographer who documented it all. So Jessica said, linking her arm through mine, "How does it feel to go from junior accountant to potential White House consultant in one evening?" "Terrifying," I admitted. "Also completely surreal. Also, maybe I've been thinking too small about what I'm capable of." Michael laughed. "Welcome to being married to a Thompson," he said to Jessica. "Apparently your family doesn't do anything halfway." As we watched the last news van disappear around the lake, I realized that everything had changed. Not just because of the president's offer or the historic evening we'd shared, but because I'd discovered something about myself that I never knew existed. I'd always thought of myself as someone who stayed in the background, who played it safe, who left the important stuff to other people. But tonight showed me that sometimes the most important moments happen precisely when you step out of the background and into the story. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Washington, D.C., carrying a portfolio of photographs that would never be published but would forever remind me of the night when everything changed. The last photo in that portfolio was one I'd taken just before leaving Thornwood Castle, Jessica and Michael dancing alone on the empty dance floor, illuminated by the soft glow of the remaining candles, with no idea that their wedding photographer was about to become part of a much larger story. Sometimes the best shots are the ones nobody expects you to take. 3 months later, I was sitting in the Roosevelt Room of the White House, surrounded by photographs that had become part of American history. The walls were lined with images from that night at Thornwood Castle. Not just my amateur shots, but professional documentation of how a simple wedding reception had become the backdrop for one of the most significant foreign policy successes of the administration. But the photo that dominated the room was mine. That spontaneous shot of the president receiving confirmation that the hostages were safe. It had been declassified, reviewed by multiple agencies, and was now being considered for the official presidential portrait collection. "Marcus," said Director Helen Rodriguez of the newly created American Stories Initiative, "in 3 months, your work has fundamentally changed how we think about documenting presidential history." She gestured toward a presentation screen showing a montage of photographs I'd taken across the country, a factory worker in Ohio whose innovative safety suggestions had prevented dozens of accidents, a teacher in rural Montana who'd created a literacy program that was being adopted nationwide, a group of teenagers in Detroit who'd transformed an abandoned lot into a community garden that now fed half their neighborhood. "These stories were always happening," she continued, "but nobody was capturing them in a way that showed their connection to the larger American narrative. Your approach, finding the human moments within the historic ones, it's revolutionized our entire documentation strategy." I still couldn't quite believe this was my life. 6 months ago, I'd been Marcus Thompson, junior accountant, whose biggest career achievement was catching a payroll error that saved our company $3,000. Now I was Marcus Thompson, special documentation consultant to the White House, whose photographs were influencing how the government told stories about itself. The door opened, and the president walked in, looking remarkably relaxed for someone who just finished a cabinet meeting about trade negotiations. "Marcus, good to see you. How was the assignment in Colorado?" "Eye-opening, sir. The renewable energy cooperative you asked me to document. It's not just about solar panels and wind turbines. It's about a community that decided to take control of their own future. The photos really capture that determination." I'd learned to speak more confidently about my work, but it still felt surreal to be having casual conversations with the most powerful person in the world. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. Helen, show him the latest developments." Director Rodriguez pulled up a new presentation, and my jaw dropped. The American Stories Initiative had expanded beyond anything I'd imagined possible. There were now 12 photographers working across the country, all using techniques derived from that accidental approach I'd discovered at Jessica's wedding. "We've documented over 400 stories in the past 3 months," Rodriguez explained. "Small-town innovations that are being scaled nationally. Community solutions to problems that Washington has been struggling with for decades. Individuals whose quiet heroism is inspiring policy changes at the federal level." "But here's the part that's really remarkable," the president added. "These aren't just feel-good stories anymore. They're actually changing how we govern. That literacy program you documented in Montana, we're implementing a version of it in 200 school districts nationwide. The Community Garden Project in Detroit, it's become the model for urban agriculture initiatives in 15 cities." He pulled up a chair and sat down across from me, abandoning all presidential formality. Marcus, you've helped us remember something crucial, that the best solutions often come from the ground up, not the top down. And the only way to find those solutions is to pay attention to the stories that usually get overlooked. It was overwhelming to think that my accidental career change was having this kind of impact. But there was something else on my mind, something I'd been meaning to discuss. Sir, I've been thinking about sustainability, not environmental sustainability, though that's important too, but the sustainability of this approach. I can't be everywhere documenting every story that matters. Go on. What if we taught other people to see stories the way we've learned to see them? What if we created a training program, not for professional photographers, but for regular people who want to document the extraordinary things happening in their own communities? The president and director Rodriguez exchanged a look that suggested this wasn't the first time this idea had come up. Funny you should mention that, Rodriguez said. We've been developing exactly that program. We're calling it the Community Stories Network. Local participants would receive basic photography training and storytelling guidance, then work with our team to identify and document stories in their own areas. We want you to lead the training program, the president said directly, not just develop the curriculum, but personally train the first 100 participants. Help them understand that they don't need expensive equipment or years of experience. They just need to care about the people around them and be willing to pay attention. It was another career leap that would have terrified me a year ago, but something fundamental had changed in how I saw myself and my capabilities. When would this start? Next month. We've already identified the first cohort. Teachers, small business owners, retirees, college students, community organizers. People who are already connected to their communities but have never thought of themselves as documentarians. The president leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. Marcus, I want you to understand what you've accomplished here. When you picked up that camera at your sister's wedding, you didn't just help document a rescue operation. You helped us rediscover how to tell American stories in a way that brings people together instead of driving them apart. He gestured toward the photographs covering the walls. Every single one of these images shows people at their best. Not perfect, not without struggles, but fundamentally decent people working to make things better for themselves and their neighbors. In a time when it's easy to believe that our differences are more important than our similarities, these stories remind us what we share. As the meeting concluded and I prepared to leave the White House, I found myself thinking about that night at Thornwood Castle. How a simple favor from my sister had led to this moment, this career, this completely unexpected life. But the real revelation wasn't about photography or government work or even personal success. It was about recognizing that everyone has stories worth telling, and that sometimes the most powerful way to change the world is simply to pay attention to the people around you. 2 weeks later, I was back in Seattle, standing in front of Jessica and Michael's house with a camera in my hand. Not the borrowed equipment from that fateful night, but professional gear that I'd finally learned to use properly. Uncle Marcus, Jessica's 6-month-old daughter, Emma, gurgled happily as I picked her up. How's my favorite niece doing? She's your only niece, Jessica pointed out, but she was smiling, and she's perfect. Just like her uncle, who somehow went from backup wedding photographer to White House consultant. As I watched Emma grab for my camera with determined little fingers, I realized this was another story worth documenting. How families grow and change, how new generations inherit the world their parents and aunts and uncles create for them. You know what, Emma? I said, holding the camera just out of her reach. Someday, when you're old enough to understand, I'm going to tell you about the night your mom's wedding changed everything. About how sometimes the most important moments start with someone just trying to help their family. Jessica laughed. Are you planning to tell her about how her uncle accidentally became part of presidential history? Actually, I said, snapping a photo of Emma's delighted expression, I'm planning to tell her about how anyone can become part of history. You just have to be willing to step up when the moment asks you to. And as I looked through the viewfinder at this newest member of our family, I knew that the most important stories were still ahead of us. Stories about ordinary people discovering they're capable of extraordinary things. Stories about families supporting each other through impossible circumstances. Stories about communities coming together to solve problems nobody thought could be solved. stories that remind us that the backup photographer might just be exactly what the moment needs. The camera clicked, capturing another beginning. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.